Actually, as I listened to his talk, Dr. Brown's talk, it was clear to me that it's really appropriate now to stand up here and talk about education, because clearly that is one of the venues, the avenues by which we can think to improve some of this. But I want to take you back to the education, to the financial crisis we now find ourselves in, because I think this affords us an opportunity to ask the important question of, is education, the educational accomplishments of a nation, and all related to the economic growth? The way out of this situation we're currently in is to achieve greater economic growth. And of course, people are talking about that. So how much does education contribute to that kind of economic growth? Well, fortunately, we have a study that just recently has come out which begins to point to an answer to that question. The economists for quite some time now have told us that what's really important is the number of years of schooling that are attained on average within a society. And so the ones that have longer school over the span of time have the greater economic growth. And so that's led to things like in the United States having kids go to school longer, going to community college after high school, and the whole push has been the more and more education and making it affordable for children to obtain. But the latest study says something much different and much more powerful. It says it's not about how long you go to school. It's about what you've learned in the time that you have gone to school, that's really the important element. And in fact, when you take that into account and you look at what the academic output of a nation is, that is what they've learned by these international tests that are given, which compare countries, that when you look at that, those countries with the greater cognitive skill level on average across their society, the greater the economic growth. And guess what? Disappears the amount of schooling. So it's not the quantity thereof, it's what it is that it produces, it's the quality thereof. And that's, I think, the important point to bring here, is it's not just how much schooling, it's the nature of how much we are providing them in terms of cognitive skills, and that's what results in economic growth. And it results in a fairly substantial, about 1/4 additional economic growth can be achieved in every year for those nations that have a higher level of academic performance on the part of their students. Translation, if the United States were to achieve, which it does not, and I'll show you that shortly, at a level comparable to the nations that are performing the best, we would simply improve our economic growth by 25% every year. And in fact, if we had done that and achieved the goal of the governors to be #1 in the world by the year 2000, by the year 2015, we would have achieved an enormous amount of economic growth, which would have more than paid for all the money we put into education. So there is a definite relationship between these two factors. But the question then becomes one of, what is it that we need in the way of jobs? If this is now about economic growth, what are the kinds of jobs that we are confronting? And here we want to look at the skills that are demanded by the U.S. economy over the years from 1960 to 2002. And we see that if you first of all look at the non-routine skills, manual skills, this is like truck driver, janitorial things. These are things you can't make automated, but they're very manually oriented. You can see that that's dropping quite a bit as a percentage of the workforce. If you look next at the one that has the most precipitous decline, it has to do with the routine sorts of manual or cognitive things. These are like the routine manual are the jobs in the factories, working in producing cars and things of that sort. Routine cognitive are secretaries, filers, receptionists, things of that sort. These jobs are, as you can see, suffering from the greatest decline as we move to the year 2002, or moved to 2002. On the other hand, the non-routine jobs are the ones that you have a much greater demand, is a growing demand. So if you just focus at this end point, you can see that the nature of the jobs are drastically changing that now drive the economy. And it's not just about driving the nation's economic growth, it's about providing jobs for the future of the children who are in the school so they can have a secure future themselves. And you can see that the nature of these jobs are quite different. Now, the question that comes here is, how well are we doing in preparing our children to attain these new types of jobs? Because the competition, as you know, is worldwide. India and China are now providing a lot of workforce issues. You call United Airlines, you likely are going to be talking to somebody in India. So the nature of the world is the flat earth, as Friedman said, is essentially making the competition not just the child sitting next to them in school, but the whole of the world's children. So how are we doing in preparing our children for that? I want to show you that, but first I want to take you on a little bit of a thought experiment. Do you all know what the OECD is? It's all of our major economic competitors. There are about 27. It's all the world's leading economies and nations. And let's imagine that we were to look at this as an Olympic ranking issue. We've got basketball, swimming, rowing, and triathlon. Now, supposing as Americans we were to find out that we ranked 15th in basketball, we ranked 21st in swimming, we ranked even lower, 24th in rowing, and in the triathlon we ranked 25th. There would be an uproar in America. This would be considered really a slippage in our national image. Well, this is not about, these are the OECD countries, and this is not about swimming, basketball, etc. This is really about the issues that we should be caring about: reading, science, problem solving, and mathematics. These are the actual rankings of our children in these international comparisons, where we give the same test worldwide to all 27 of these countries. And you can see the nature of our ranking. Look at the problem solving. Think back to the previous slide where it was a great deal important to be concerned with non-routine jobs, cognitive sort, where you had to be interactive, you had to solve problems. And look at the fact we ranked 24th. Mathematics has become the language of so many jobs now, and we rank 25th out of 27 with respect to our performance in mathematics. So the short answer is we're not preparing our children particularly well to confront the types of jobs they need to be successful in the world, to be successful for themselves, not only for the nation as a whole. Well, things like that are sometimes not very illustrative of just how serious the problem is. And I don't want to depress you any further, but hey, what the heck. So here's a couple of items just to give you a sense of what's going on here. This question asks, what's the fraction? Which fraction is located between 3/8 and 7/8? The rest of the world teaches fraction, a problem, an area that's so difficult for our students, by introducing it in terms of the number line, so it's related to all the other numbers, the whole numbers. So this is a relatively simple item in the world. It's done in about 2nd grade. How do our kids do in a national sample? Well, you can see even by 5th grade, half the kids cannot do this item. I tell you, they can't go on much further if they can't do this. They can't really achieve algebra, which is the fundamental language of so much now in mathematics. They're not going to make it if they can't do even and recognize where a fraction is. Well, it gets worse. Here you just have to do a simple computation with a fraction. And now by 8th grade, half of our kids can't do that. That's an item that in the rest of the world is achieved by most children down around 3rd grade. Now, I'm a statistician by training, and we like patterns. And that 50% in the world of No Child Left Behind is a pretty important number as it keeps recurring. It suggests that we're leaving about half of our children behind the world standard, behind where they ought to be in terms of their performance. At 8th grade in the rest of the world, they're studying algebra, not simply doing fractions. Half of our kids are still working on fractions, and they still don't get it by the end of 8th grade. Well, are you depressed enough by now? Because here's one that'll really get you. Now it's look at this item. It's not about anything sophisticated. This is about thinking quantitatively. It's like, I would like to argue with you, there are 2 types of literacy which we as a society should be concerned with. One type of literacy is the standard one you think about. Can you read and can you comprehend? The other one is, can you think quantitatively? This just asks, how much ribbon do you need? You want to guess how much the high school what percentage of the high school class of 2004 could pass that item? Well, once again, we come up with the 50%. And now this has all been mathematics. Now if you want to talk about science, and that is, we were talking about the seasons. Tom was talking about the seasons and the cyclical nature of it and so forth. Well, if you look at this item, it asks them if they understand why we do have those seasons. And this is a good opportunity to reason if they know these facts about which of these facts are correct about the world. And I won't ask any of you know the answer to this question. But you can see by, again, 8th grade, only about 40% of our kids can do this, then understand that it has to do with the tilt. It's not about the distance from the sun to the earth. It has to do with the fact that the earth is on a tilt. And so therefore, once again, even in science, focusing on mathematics, but in science as well, the performance of our students is not very strong. And you have to wait a second for this display, but this is really important because remember, the whole focus of these jobs is on problem solving, being able to think analytically, being able to reason your way through this. If you look at this, it's going to take a while. Where the U.S. falls on this with 15-year-olds on the ability for them to extrapolate and apply scientific knowledge. There we are finally, behind most of Europe, most of Asia, most of the OECD countries, outperforming only some very few sets of countries. So this is the lay of the land. This is the depressing part. This suggests that the issues that you hear and read about are really serious. It's not just that we're not competing well in some mental Olympics. What we are not doing is giving our children a fundamental education in the mathematics and the science areas in order to achieve, in order to succeed, in order to keep our economy running, in order for them to achieve jobs that are disappearing. That is, the jobs of the sort that you have a strong back aren't there anymore. Even the manufacturing jobs are driven by computers and things of that sort. So the world is changing, and we're leaving our children without the tools by which to function in that new economy, in that new society. Well, where do we go from here? What's the solution? It's one thing to stand up here and tell you the problem. Well, let me talk about that for a moment. One of the things that we've learned from these international studies is that we do not challenge our children. We do not have standards which demand of them a certain level of knowledge. Put simply, we've done this study and we looked at this by the end of 8th grade. Our children are some 2 years behind, not in performance, but in what they at least study. They're 2 years behind much of the rest of the world. The rest of the world in 7th and 8th grade is studying algebra, geometry, physics, chemistry, and biochemistry. We in the United States are studying arithmetic and rocks and body parts, as I like to call it. The rest of the world's children learn how you see, how the photons create an electrochemical reaction by which your brain then interprets, and that's what you see. We simply know the parts of the eye as the iris, the retina, etc. There's a major difference to that. And that's part of what the real issue is. The countries that are achieving well have high levels of expectations for their children. The middle school are demanding years. In this country, they're essentially an intellectual wasteland. They're a highly repetitive version of what they had in the first 5 years of schooling. Well, what we also can talk about is that when we look at the top achieving countries, the math topics listed along the left aren't particularly important. It's the pattern. The columns are grades 1 to 8. If you see here, you see a pattern, a very distinct pattern, that the topics at the bottom are dealt with only after the topics at the top are dealt with. Mathematics is logical. It's not an arbitrary collection of things. It's a progression from the simple to the more complex. And you see in here the fact that they focus in the early grades on a few things. They just focus on getting kids to understand number and measurement in the first couple grades. And by the 8th grade, they're talking about very serious advanced topics that lead to a deeper understanding of mathematics. And that progression is a very logical, connected progression. Well, you might say to me, well, isn't that obvious? What's the alternative? Well, I'm going to show you the alternative. I'm going to show you this same slide for 20-some states here in the United States. We're talking about state standards, which supposedly govern our system. What do they look like? I'm going to hold everything the same for each of these states. And what you see here is the U.S., where you see essentially that we have dots everywhere. There is no progression. It's an arbitrary collection of things. In 1st and 2nd grade, while they focus on 3, we're trying to teach those little kids 20-some topics. It's ridiculously chaotic. The American educational philosophy and curriculum in mathematics and in science, I could show you the same slides, is you teach everything everywhere because then somehow somebody will learn something somewhere. And I can assure you it doesn't work. And that's the heart of the problem. It also shows that even a statistician knows alliteration. But anyway, this kind of a system is what our children function under. And it is not going to work. And it is related to why our children do so poorly in these international comparisons. So one of the things we need to do is to improve, to increase the level of demand for our society. We need to eliminate that 2-year gap that exists at the end of 8th grade. And by the way, by the end of high school, we still don't haven't caught up to the rest of the world. The rest of the world considers our first 2 years of college as high school. Have you ever had any foreign exchange students? They love coming here during their high school years because they can blow most of it off, because they've had it by about 8th or 9th grade. That's the level of difference we're talking about. It's not so complicated. It's simply a matter, if you have a greater set of demands and you have those demands for all your children, basically, on average, those children will achieve better. And to the first slide, will be better prepared for those jobs which the future, which is now, are available and which provide the economic growth for the nation. So this really is the first element that we have to focus on, is bringing up that level of standard. Now, we'll go back to the economists and the economic study I cited earlier. One of the questions there that they looked at, which I think is a very important question, they looked at the question of, so where do you put your resources? To whom do you provide this high-level education? Is it enough to provide it simply for the elite? Those kids that are bright, those kids that have all the advantages of life, they live in the suburbs, their parents are educated, they have a lot of money, the community in which they live puts a lot of money into education, they have the best teachers. Is it okay that we just focus on those kids? Well, I'm so delighted with the answer, because it's no. We need to educate all of our children across our whole of society, to the rural areas, to the rural poor, to our big cities, to the minority kids, to the low social class kids. The answer is very clear. If we don't address them as well to raise the level of knowledge there, we will not achieve the kind of economic growth that we should be wanting. And it's not just an economic argument, I would argue, it's a moral argument. How could we simply ignore such a large proportion of our population who we don't know necessarily can't do this, we only know they come from a different origin than those of us who seem to run most of the system in education. So this raises the second issue that I want to bring to your attention, which is the importance of reaching all of those children. You know, our economist Tom said that we're really strong on individuality in our society, and we're a little short on social justice. You couldn't have set me up better, because our educational system is driven by this individuality. It's the notion that every kid can succeed if he or she does their own thing, and those that fail because they don't take advantage of the opportunities they have. And those other kids just don't care enough about schooling. That's why they don't succeed. Well, all of that is predicated on one very important assumption, which isn't true, that it's a level playing field, that they are given equal opportunity. It's not true in America. That's the harsh reality, that's just not a correct statement. And I'll show you a bit of data briefly to make that point. So we fall short on this social justice in this important arena as well. And the individuality we have is what I would call also a form of aggregate individuality. The American educational system is run by 15,000 plus local school districts across this country. They can be little areas by a couple miles of radius. But there are 15,000. Michigan has 600. New York, I think, has somewhere around that number or higher even. There are just huge numbers of these local school districts. And why do I bring that point up? Because what you have, if you look at the data, here are some major U.S. districts: Chicago, Miami, Rochester, New York, suburbs, rural areas in South Carolina. There's a collection of these here. And this slide shows you that if you look at the percent of the students whose parents are college educated, a social class measure in that district, what is their academic achievement in mathematics? And you can see almost a perfect linear relationship here. Translation: the districts that have the higher social class have the kids that perform the best. Every real estate agent in this country knows this and uses it as a selling device for selling houses. But here's another piece of reality. If you look at a measure of what percent of those children within the districts are taking the more advanced kinds of 8th grade curriculum of algebra and geometry, which is more like the rest of the world, look at how that's related to the achievement. Very strongly, the same very strong linear relationship. So which is it? Is it social class, or is it school that makes a difference to children's performance? Well, it says both of them are. then what's the real answer? Well, the real answer for the United States is this slide, which is the Achilles heel of our educational system. Here's the social class along there, here's the curriculum along there, and you've what? Have a similarly strong linear relationship. Basically what that means is those districts that are higher social class have higher standards for their children, higher expectations. Those children in the high social class districts are given a better, more demanding education, more consistent with the rest of the world. So our system is essentially stacked against those who live in places where the social class is not that high. And it can be summarized by this slide, that basically social class influences student learning. We know that worldwide. That correlation exists in the entire world we've studied of 50 countries. So is the standards. We've proven that. I have a book out called Why Schools Matter. It's because what we teach makes a difference. I showed you slides of that earlier. But the differences in the United States is this green arrow going from social class up to the curriculum. Because not only does the social class have a direct effect, it has an indirect effect. So it's magnified. In the rest of the world, the green arrow doesn't exist because they have national standards, which are standards for everybody. And so basically, that's the resolution of a lot of this. We as a nation need to step up like virtually every other nation and have nationally specified standards. I don't mean by the federal government, I mean nationally specified, probably by the governors. But until we have standards that apply to all, this huge inequality in our system will exist. And social injustice will continue to exist within our educational system, dooming a large set of our children to a lesser education, to lesser jobs, to a lesser great future. And so basically, I come around to this point again of the social injustice. It's not just an economic argument. It's not just economically stupid to not educate all of our children. It's morally reprehensible. It's dishonest. We simply are saying to a set of children, you cannot have the same opportunities as others just because of where you live, the color of your skin, or how wealthy your parents are. Virtually all other nations of the world don't accept that. And yet we do. And it simply exacerbates the social injustice that Tom was talking about. And it perpetuates it on the least, the ones that can least defend themselves, our children, yet our greatest resource. Well, what happens in the consequence, and I'll draw to a conclusion here, is that if we look at the high school graduation, we used to lead the world on this. If you look, it's the greenish part on the bottom is the 1960s. And if you look at this, we were number one in the world in the 1960s in the number of children who completed high school. And if you look at a country like Korea, they were 27th. Now let's update it. They're now number one, we're number 13. It is only about 69% of the age cohort that graduates from high school in the 12 years it would take to get there. And if you go to the college level, it's not any better because we once were dominant with respect to that. Number two is recently as 1995, but now today we are 15th in terms of college graduates. The rest of the world has figured this out, how important it is to educate all of their children and to work hard to have them, all of them, to finish high school and many of them to go on to college. And don't forget the multiplier effect. You know, India and China, if they just graduate a small percentage, when you multiply by 1.3 billion, you get a big number. And so these numbers will overwhelm the rest of the world with 40% of the population living in those two countries. Well, let me close by going back to the economic issue that I started out with. We see that it does make a difference. But if we look at the crisis we're now in, and we back up, as the analysts have done, and we find that one of the problems was a lack of regulation, or at least the enforcement of regulation. A great deal of individualistically driven greed on the parts of certain individuals presaged this particular collapse and these particular economic problems, not totally, but in part. Well, I want to suggest to you and leave with this glum thought. And that is that basically, I believe in education, we're heading for the same type of a real crisis. And it's not far off. We don't educate all. We don't have regulations in the form of nationally specified standards which apply to all children. So we have a same kind of a problem. We have a system that is driven by greed of a certain sort, where those that have get more, and those that don't get less and less. So in a certain sense, the issues parallel. And I would suggest to you there are enough people at the economic level and at the CEOs that I'm privileged to talk to who tell me this is not far off, a tipping point where we may well slide down because we have not educated those of our own population. We can no longer continue to import all of our talent. The rest of the world is keeping a lot of it. This is how we got by for a while. But we have many jobs. In Northeast Ohio, there are some 30,000 jobs unfilled, but they demand a certain level of knowledge in math and science. So this is the problem we face in education. But I too end on a positive note. We now know what the issues are. We can fix these. We need to move on this. And what it's going to take is political will to solve these problems. We know how to do this, but we just don't have the political will. Unlike the climate change, where all of a sudden that became more dominant and people are now responding, we haven't reached that point in education. We continue to know that these problems lie there. I just warn you, I don't know how much longer, and I'm a real optimist, how much longer we can survive before we end up with another form of collapse which will hit our society and our economy just as hard as the one that's currently hitting us. Thank you.